So, putting PV on your house. So if you haven't got much space on your roof, then depending on how far away from the house you are, you can put it on a shed. We're even talking to people about building new verandas and pergolas for them that you can put PV panels onto, so that you can get more PV in, because it's one of the easiest investments to make. Obviously, all you've got to make sure is that you can get the electricity that it generates through to where your house is, but that can be done with armoured cables. I got asked the other day whether there was anything you could do to a house because it was listed, and there's plenty you can do, and even if it's just an old house, and if anything, actually the older houses are the easier ones to make a massive difference to, because if you've already got cavity wall insulation, then that first, what they call the low-hanging fruit, has already been taken. But with an old house, you've got a U value that is about 6 times even the minimum performance, possibly more like 8 times the current minimum performance for a new wall. And so even a bit of insulation on that will make a massive difference. If you've got internal features you want to keep and you're not facing the street, you can externally insulate it, which is better, but you might lose external brick features you like. Certainly on the front, where you've got a nice frontage to the house, you don't really want to lose all of those features, so we tend to advise internal insulation at that point. There are internal insulants that you can use that you can retain features with, or we have a brilliant plasterer who can remake cornices. Not the cheapest game in the book, but he can do those. I can make you curved skirting boards if you've got those bull noses round the window openings. Obviously up in the roof, you can insulate roof spaces, because quite a lot of older houses have rooms up there. We can make those comfier and far less likely to overheat. Under floors is usually simple, because older houses have suspended floors, so you can go in underneath. Sometimes the undercrofts are too small to go underneath, you have to do other things. Windows, this house here, which is our trial retrofit from 20 years ago, we secondary glazed all of the original stained glass features, and it's not as good as a new window, but it's an awful lot better than it was. So how much PV can you get on your house? You can go online to websites like Compare My Solar and have a look. It's a slightly clunky interface, so if that is actually really quite alarming, give us a ring. We've got some access to some other sites that we can use that are slightly better, or we send somebody round with a ladder and a laser measure, or we even use LiDAR scanning, where we'll scan the bit of the roof so we can measure it and actually find the best panels for the size of the roof. We're doing a house in Salford at the moment where we're going to be able to get 11 kilowatts onto their roof, but that involved me up a ladder waving a LiDAR scanner around to get the full sizes of all of the bits of roof. Windows, they're quite a big question. They're really expensive, and especially the wooden ones, but quite frankly, they perform so much better than the plastic ones. We've been trying of late to save customers some money by looking at plastic windows where they need them replacing, and we just can't get the thermal performance up to where you can get to with wood. The other problem with the plastic windows is that because plastic's quite bendy and weedy, you can't have those enormous, great big windows that let more light in. And obviously it's letting the light in is the bit where you get the solar gain in winter and spring and autumn. Obviously summer, probably just open the window at that point because you don't want that much. Obviously they're more eco because plastic's not wildly recyclable, but also plastic windows tend to deform over time or go brittle over time or fade. So most people tend to advise them to only last 25 years, whereas we put wooden windows in 20 years ago and they're showing no signs of wear. That idea that wooden windows are a maintenance liability is not borne out by modern paint finishes. We encounter quite a lot of properties that are older, and therefore many people have done things to them over time. It's not that difficult. It just means we have to spend a bit more time measuring. If you've got the drawings, that's really helpful. Sometimes we have to drill holes in the walls to find out what went on in the extension. We came across an extension built in the 80s the other day, no insulation at all in the cavity wall. What were they thinking of? So we find that stuff out while we plan your retrofit. Sometimes it means that if it's already insulated, we can just use thinner insulation on that new bit, or if it's a really new bit, we just leave that bit alone and retrofit around it. You can put PV just about anywhere that you can hold it down in a wind. So obviously if it's a really, really teeny shed, probably not put it on that, but a flat roof is not a bad shout, although you do need to make sure that when you're fixing it down, to make sure it doesn't blow away, that you don't put holes in your flat roof membrane that mean it leaks, because that would be annoying. This can be done in multiple ways. We've done installs years ago now where we put steel structures across a big flat roof. We managed to get 11 kilowatts onto that one. So we built a galvanised steel structure that sat on structural support points either side, and it's not going anywhere. We've even got PV on Kev, which is a flat roof. And we did that by the fixings being down the side of the roof rather than being on the top of it, so that the water goes past it, as it were. But there are also modern systems around where, if your roof is up to it, where you have a kind of ballast on the frame that you fill with gravel or water, usually gravel or concrete blocks, so that the wind can't blow it away because it's held down. But obviously you need a roof able to take that load, because you do still want the panels at an angle. Although the ones on our community engagement vehicle are at 5 degrees and they seem to generate quite happily. It's something we model for you. Get in touch. You can do most aspects of a retrofit any time in the year that you want. The only bit you have to be a little bit careful about is when it gets parky and you want to insulate externally. And obviously if you want to have any work done to your roof, best not do that during the Manchester monsoon. Although who knows when that is these days. But it does look these days like we're getting quite dry summers. So that's the best time to do anything to do with your roof. We have ended up having to do covered scaffolding so that we can push the time we can do external insulation further into the rainy season. But the other bit you need to be careful about is you mustn't install the render when it's below freezing. In fact, you're not supposed to install the render below 5 degrees without putting an accelerant in it, but I'm kind of slightly skeptical about whether that's advisable anyway. I mean, they say it'll work, but we have had one house where it was rendered during a cold snap and it's got little patches on it, and some poor souls have ended up with the whole of the insulation going green, so don't do that. But you can do the rest of it whenever you like. But if, for example, you're going to do the roof in midsummer and you're not taking the roof off, you're sending an operative up there to do loft insulation, don't ask them to do that in the middle of a heat wave. So damp in your house. 53% of UK households complain of mould. It's almost always to do with condensation because of inadequate ventilation or too much moisture for what the walls can handle. And so there's two bits to that. But if your house is a very old house, or even a newer house but with absolutely rubbish insulation, you can end up with patches where it gets so cold that the air inside the house, when it meets that bit of wall, drops off its water, because cold air holds less moisture than warm air. So we all breathe out, that's high humidity, it reaches that cold patch on the wall and it condenses. Now you can offset that with ventilation, obviously, but it's a bit of a double picture. You need to make sure that you haven't got those patches of heat loss as well as ventilating. You want to ventilate anyway to get rid of all of the pathogens and stop the dust mites growing. They die off below 55% humidity, so you can make life easier if you can get your house dry. And also, if you've got patches behind sofas in front of an uninsulated wall, you're not going to be able to ventilate that. That's just going to go a little bit furry, which you're probably not going to like. And then you get mold breaking out and that's bad for you. But also if you've got an unventilated bathroom or kitchen and you're producing a lot of moisture, then if you don't get rid of that, it's going to find its way around the house. So it is good to make sure you ventilate properly. We can give you all the advice you need on that. So how much loft insulation should you have? Well, our view is it's one of the cheapest bits of the house to insulate. It's, as long as you're careful about ventilation, it's one of the easiest bits to do, and therefore why not? But obviously each inch of insulation has done more work than the next inch of insulation and the next inch of insulation. But it means that it's so easy to do, why not go for 400 mil? When you have the grant givers round, they tend to go for 250 mil as a minimum. We tend to advise 400 mil because it produces a U value that is a nice point. It's the only bit of the house you can get to 0.1 watts per square metre per degree of temperature change. So we just tend to advise to go for that. So you've got a conservatory. You're wondering what to do with it. Most of the time there's not much you can do. I've encountered people that have roofed over the top of their conservatories to create an external room. The problem with that is it's an awful lot of glass. It's not normally particularly high performing because it's not in the job description of a conservatory, and therefore you end up with quite a high heat loss element of your home. They can also be a bit dingy once you've covered over the roof because they tend to be quite deep plan. Our advice on conservatories is not to treat them as part of what we call the heated envelope. As in, don't put a radiator in there, please. You're going to pay a fortune and the emissions that go with it to heat that. You're better off having a decent performing door between the conservatory and the rest of the house, and just accept that that room gets used when the sun's been out and it's warmed it up a bit, or you've got people round, so you're going to warm it up for that day, rather than try and treat it as something that you want to incorporate into the house. If you are going to incorporate it into the house, you're going to need to think about quite a lot of insulation, and I think the cost may well be a little daunting. So there's quite a lot of bit of houses where there's a bit attached to them or under them or partly under them, like a garage or the old carsy that you're not, or the shed, and you're not sure how to treat those. So garages, in some of the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s houses, they're built partly under the house. So in deciding what to do with those, you need to decide what it is you want it for. If you want to just leave it for the car, you don't need to keep the car warm, it'll forgive you. And so you insulate between the garage and the rest of the house. Quite easy to do because you'd have no moisture movement usually through that wall. So you can insulate the wall, say between the stairwell and the garage. The roof above it will have some poor soul's bedroom directly above that. That's well worth getting some insulation into. Depending on how much headroom you've got, you can just stick something to the underside of it, because again, you don't need masses of ceiling height in a garage. But if you want to use the garage as a bit of additional space and incorporate it into the house, then you're going to want to insulate that wall between the garage and the outside. You're probably going to want to think about what's going on with the garage door. I have seen insulated garage doors, but when they say insulated, they're not even close to the kind of performance you want for your house. And obviously they've got an enormous perimeter around them to let the drafts through. You're better off whipping that out and putting an insulated wall in there. You can do that timber frame, you don't need to do it with masonry, at which point you can lose very little of the room and get an awful lot of insulation into it, maybe have a different finish on the outside. When it comes to things like sheds, in a way it's the same treatment. Is it outside what we call the heated envelope, or is it inside it? And just make sure that the boundary of your heated envelope is continuous, so you haven't got cold bridges. And so if it's just for storing stuff in, put the wall insulation between the warm bit of the house and the shed. If you want to incorporate it into the house, then wrap the insulation that you're going to do, hopefully externally if it's on the back, round the whole thing. Does involve a bit of athletics around the roof, but we can deal with that. We have the technology. Some people think that new buildings don't need any insulation, they've already had it done. What we've encountered is an alarming amount of time where actually it still needs a bit of work. We've been looking at a house built in the early noughties, and it's cavity wall, but the insulation's been really badly put in. Now, if you're longer in the tooth like me and you've seen people doing insulation into masonry walls, you'll realise that that's not much of a surprise, because there's wall ties across the brickwork, and sometimes people are just posting in bits of insulation between the wall ties. So you've got gaps between it. They may not have used much insulation at all, but in an alarming number of cases, there isn't any insulation in there. But even if you haven't got one of those, you've got something built in the last 15 years, there are still things you can do, because getting your house to any version of zero carbon, or for the sake of a version that you can go with, let's say that you want to go for a net zero operational energy on your home, as in you can generate off the roof what your home needs to run itself, then the first point to call is how much PV can you get on the roof? The payback is really quite quick in terms of savings. You can get it on a house as low as 7 years, although 8, 9, 10 are better figures if it's a complicated roof or access is complicated or you want to use really nice panels. So there's that. We're talking to a household where we're going to replace their conservatory with a solar pergola with see-through panels, so they're 80% efficient, so the rest of it is letting the light through so that they don't cook the house, and they also then don't cook underneath the veranda, but they'll have something they can sit out under. That's getting them an extra 5 kilowatts of generation. But what you can also do then is you put battery storage in so that you can then use the energy that you generated during the day for when you want it in the evening. And there are often ways that you can improve the performance of the house. We did an air tightness test on a modern house recently, and we're a little surprised at the bizarre places the air got in. Round the saw pipes, it was gushing in. They'd had a new kitchen installed and they hadn't properly sealed around where the air inlet was for the fan. So air rushed into the floor cavity, and then was coming out through the downlighters in the kitchen. It had managed to find its way to a hole between the stairs, and we tracked that back to an ensuite where they hadn't properly sealed the service inlets into that one. Cavities, if there's air bricks in the cavities, then if you've got joist ends sat into those on the inner leaf, the air can get around those. So there are a whole load of bits of air tightness work you can do where you can make quite a lot of difference. We also encounter houses where maybe the floors haven't been done. We haven't done it yet, if I'm honest. We've got a specification for doing insulation on top of the floor, but it involves so much messing we tend not to. But you can top up the loft. But obviously you can go for an air source heat pump plus PV plus battery and make an enormous amount of difference. But we'll help you look for those other places that maybe a little bit of something can be done to help out. We do get asked, in fact we've done quite a lot of retrofits for people with homes in conservation areas. You do not need to abandon all hope. You need to be careful, and you need to find out what the basis of the conservation area status is, and if you're doing anything to the outside of the house, you may well have to go for conservation area consent to make some changes. But we've done external wall insulation round the gable and down the back of a house in the Whalley Range conservation area, and because that conservation area status doesn't include the windows, we made all the windows nice big clear openings, inward openers with huge swathes of glass, made the house loads lighter but also quite a lot more efficient. But we refurbished the front so that it looks like the day it was built, obviously other than the windows. Other places though, we've encountered resistance to external wall insulation even on the back. And so we're negotiating on that one at the moment. We think we're going to be able to convince that particular planning authority that actually if we do it in the style of how things were built at the time, that will be acceptable. But yeah, on the whole, you've just got to be sensible, take some care, be respectful to the buildings. After all, that's what a conservation area is for. We quite like them. If you've gone and managed to get hold of one of those unusual buildings, firstly, I'm jealous. Secondly, get in touch before you make all your decisions about what to do with it, so we can help you make that as near to zero carbon as your budget will enable you to get to, or put it in stages so you can do it in bits. I've done advice for somebody who bought an old church and Sunday school. It took quite a lot of additional thinking because there are enormous volumes of space in the Sunday school element. We were looking at ways of doing the ventilation better. There's an awful lot more wall to insulate. You're not going to be doing it externally because the whole building is a little sweetie, but quite a lot of it could be done internally because they were smooth plastered walls. As long as we retained the battered reveals, they're just insulated, and so we retained the vibe of the space. We managed to get up into the roof, get some insulation in there, and then reboard those bits. Floors were a little bit more of a challenge. May yet come back and do that another year, but it was a flagged floor. You're not going to want to mess with that. What you do is you design the energy consumption around the fact that that bit may well not be so good, and you top it up elsewhere. But yeah, do please let us let us help you on one of those. We like them a lot. Payback on investment is a question we get asked a lot, and I suppose it depends on what you mean by payback. Do you mean that you've increased the value of your home sufficient that when you sell it you will get that money back? And in which case, actually, certainly since Vladimir's adventures in Eastern Europe, where people have become a lot more aware of their energy costs, property values are now holding the amount of money spent on making them more energy efficient. So that's one thing you can do. If it's a straightforward, I put this money in, I want it back, then it's PV, photovoltaic, sun off, electricity off your roof. That's the quickest one. On big roofs that are really simple, we can get paybacks as low as 6 years. More complicated, you can get it back in 8 to 9. Servicing of modern renewable technology is a question we get asked, and well, it's pretty much like your boiler really. If you've got a heat pump, then talk to your installer about getting an annual check on it. There's not much to go wrong, and you don't have to have an annual gas safety check. There's plenty of ways that the installer can monitor your unit remotely as well in some cases, and yeah, get that serviced. PV, you shouldn't need to get it serviced at all. However, if you've got a roof particularly popular with the bird life, you may want to find a way of getting your panels cleaned. And as we've encountered, you may want to stop the pigeons perching on the top edge, because then when they shuffle off this mortal coil, they drop down the back of it and then they go a bit icky round the back of the panels, which some poor soul has to clear out at some point, and it's just horrible. You do have to replace the inverters after somewhere in the region of 10 years, although that use life is getting longer. And it's similar with batteries. They've got a warranted number of charge cycles, usually between 8 and 10,000 cycles, which is theoretically about 30 years. But we've tended, when we've done payback models for people, have assumed a worst case and put them in for replacement at 10 years. Our battery partners at Alpha ESS have told us that actually 15's fine.